Hello and welcome to day 3 of Women and Antiquity. Today we're going to be talking about ancient Egypt and the idea of the female king as represented by the anomalous and yet perhaps in some ways representative Pharaoh Hatshepsut. So first a little background on ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt exists exactly where it does today, but today we tend to think of a block of land that stretches from the Red Sea to Libya and southward to the Sudan. And this is the modern concept of the territorial state, which is very much an anachronism, very much not the way that ancients thought about land and nations. In the ancient world, nations radiated outward from concentrated centers of population and identity. In a place like Sumer, this would be radiating outward from the cities. In Egypt, this is radiating outward from the Nile. And this is reinforced by the fact that even in Egypt today, the land not very far from the Nile in either direction is desert, which is difficult to inhabit without modern technology. The population of Egypt was, in the ancient world, clustered entirely around the waters of the Nile. And we'll come back to the Nile in a moment. Egypt, in its earliest origins, was actually two nations or territories. Upper Egypt, which is upward toward the source of the Nile, lies in the south, and then downstream is Lower Egypt, which is where the Nile flows toward and past into the Mediterranean. So if you think about Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, you need to think about it in terms of the Nile and the fact that it flows from its sources in Africa down toward the Mediterranean. The earliest stories of Egypt involve their unification on the order of 5,000 years ago, which leads to the foundation of the United Kingdom of Egypt under the First Dynasty, starting around 2700 BCE, and lasting for on the order of 500 years. This is known as the Old Kingdom, and this is the period in which Egypt is at its most grand and splendid and powerful, and the period in which the pharaoh represents the pinnacle of human power over the mortal world. It is during the Old Kingdom that we have the creation of almost everything that we identify with the idea of ancient Egypt, including the pyramids, the Sphinx, the great temples of Luxor, and the key foundation ideas of Egyptian mythology, their pantheon, and the idea of the pharaoh as a representation of, a manifestation of the Egyptian god Horus as part of a eternal cycle of the gods ruling over humans through their god king, the pharaoh. The Old Kingdom breaks down, and then there is a brief resurgence in the second millennium, 2040 to 1780. This is the Middle Kingdom. After this, Egypt is ruled over by foreigners. This is called the Hyksos invasion. Hyksos is the name that the Egyptians had for the foreign princes that ruled over Egypt during this period and called themselves Pharaoh. The Egyptians are finally able to throw off the foreigners and reestablish independence and rule over United Egypt in the New Kingdom, their last great grasp of glory. And this lasts all the way to the end of the Bronze Age. The New Kingdom is a resurgence, but it's also a reshaped Egypt. Egypt is both the same as it was and is transformed by the transformed nature of the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age economy has required has become a more interconnected, interdependent world. Bronze requires control of distant resources. The nature of the Bronze Age economy involves the increasing production of industrial goods, bronze goods and other goods, which means the finding of more and more materials and the creating of more and more markets, and a bigger and more involved economy in the entire Eastern Mediterranean. By the time the New Kingdom comes around, Egypt is no longer as isolated as it once was. Old Kingdom Egypt is very much insular. It is surrounded by desert and water. It is strong enough to resist any foreigners. Its economy is entirely self-sufficient. But by the time we get to the New Kingdom, everything has changed, and Egypt is forced to deal with the outside world, and that has an effect on Egyptian culture, Egyptian society, concepts of class and gender, and everything else. The entire Bronze Age economy collapses around 1100. The Egyptians call this the period of calamities. And so the collapse of the economy, combined with a massive influx of hostile refugees and a number of other factors, bring down the Egyptian kingdom along with all of the other great Bronze Age powers. The Bronze Age collapses completely all through the Eastern Mediterranean. And some of the nations recover and build new societies, particularly the Greeks, but also the Assyrians. The Egyptians never resurge after the period of calamities. The Iron Age for Egypt is primarily a period of either they are inconsequential or they are being ruled over by either the Persians or the Macedonians under Alexander the Great, who come and conquer the Persian Empire, including Egypt, and establish Ptolemaic Egypt under the rule of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, i.e., the successors of the Macedonian Greeks, starting with Ptolemy and ending with Cleopatra. And then after that, of course, after Cleopatra, Egypt is under Roman rule. So during the Iron Age, Egypt exists as a nation that had once been great, and as a nation that continued to be an important agricultural presence, but never again as a power the way it had been in the Bronze Age. Egypt has been called the gift of the Nile, and this is one of the truest statements that has ever been spoken. The thing about the Nile, is that it performs the usual function of a great river. The earliest societies are created around great rivers, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Yellow River, and so forth. And this partly, has to do with the ability of a great river to provide not only, irrigation, the necessary aspects of agriculture, but also access to distant resources. A civilization involves planting yourself in a particular place and then being dependent on what exists in that place already, combined with what you are able to acquire at a distance. And travel in the ancient world is most easily accomplished by water. The ancients had much more difficult time traveling over land, and the movement of people and cargo and ideas was by far greater on water, great rivers and moving around the coastlines of great oceans. They didn't have the ships that were capable of crossing great expanses of water. So normally these would be coastal vessels that kept in sight of land. So the Nile performs the conventional function of a great river in ancient civilization, but the Nile is also special and unique. And the reason for this is that it reliably, extremely reliably, almost infallibly floods every year. And that flooding contains and deposits the rich and fertile soil that the Nile is bringing with it from its upper reaches onto the lands surrounding it in Egypt. And so as a result, every year, almost without fail, the Nile floods and provides a bounty to the people of Egypt. It provides the not only sustenance but abundance, and so as a result, the people of Egypt have a worldview that is in stark contrast to the people of Sumer. The people of Egypt rely upon, depend upon the benevolence of nature and see the gods as being protectors and providers. And as a result, their king, instead of being an intermediary and a champion and a protector from the gods, or even against the gods, their king performs the function of being an agent of the gods, an agent of the gods' protection and benevolence, and the gods' ability to provide. And so the Pharaoh becomes all-powerful precisely because he is seen as being a manifestation of the power and benevolence of the gods that protect Egypt. And this becomes incorporated into the mythology so that the Pharaoh is depicted as being the manifestation of the god Horus. And furthermore, the cyclical nature of the Nile also becomes embedded intrinsic to the Egyptian worldview, so that the Egyptians see not only the gods as being powerful and providing and benevolent, but see everything as being part of a permanent cycle, that nothing truly ever changes. And so even the death of a pharaoh is part of this cycle of transformation in which the protection of the gods is constantly renewed, just as it is by the Nile. And so the permanence of everything, the fact that nothing ever changes, means that the pharaoh's death is seen as being not an ending but a transition, not only for the pharaoh but also for the Egyptians. And the pharaoh's death is a key moment of renewal, transition and renewal. So the pharaoh's death is something that is very important to the Egyptians. There's a period of time in which the importance of this is manifested by the pyramids, the burial tombs of certain pharaohs of the Egyptian Old Kingdom. But this is part of a larger idea of how the Egyptians deal with death, which is that the body is preserved in this life as a sort of tether to ensure the comfortable persistence of the spirit as it proceeds through the eternity of afterlife. And so the preservation of the physical remains of the pharaoh would be particularly important, and the idea that Egyptians need to take care of this is a response to a recognition of the importance of the relationship between the gods and the Egyptians through their pharaoh. One of the things that's striking to us is the pharaoh is all powerful. There, in the Old Kingdom especially, the ordinary Egyptian has no voice in the conduct of society. And so, we're familiar with the problems of absolute power, and we see in modern history, the corruption that is involved in absolute monarchy. So the question becomes, what prevents the absolute power of the Egyptian pharaoh from transforming into abuse and oppression? And part of the answer of this is understanding the idea of ma'at. The idea of ma'at, this is an Egyptian word that refers to harmony and balance. And as a result, this idea is extended into meaning justice. The idea of ma'at is that this is an essential component of the role of the pharaoh. The pharaoh exists in order to manifest the protective, benevolent nature of Horus and the gods through himself. And so, as a result, the way in which this presents itself in the ordinary world is balance, harmony, peace, justice. If things are imbalanced, if things are unjust, then this is an interference with, this is a problem with, this is a disruption of the responsibilities of the pharaoh. And so the pharaoh has absolute power, but it is absolute power to manifest the benevolence of the gods and to ensure ma'at, to ensure harmony and balance and justice among mortals in Egypt. The gods of Egypt are represented as anthropomorphic animals, and this is something that is particularly striking. What we're seeing here is the falcon, the god Horus himself, and often you'll see a part man, part animal figure, so that you have a god like Anubis, who has the head of a jackal and the body of a man. There are a number of things that you can say with regard to this. The main thing is that the humans of the ancient world tend to see the chaos of nature as being associated with the gods. One of the reasons that religion is invented is in order to understand and categorize and define, and therefore sort of box up the destructive chaos of nature. And so the idea of the gods as being animalistic identifies them with the wild, identifies them with the other. And so, as we saw with Sumer, the gods are that which humans are not. Humans are mortal and moral for the Sumerians. For the Egyptians, the gods are immortal and and wild, characteristic of the profound potency of nature, in contrast to the humans that benefit from it in the bounty of the Nile. And so, as a result, it's very interesting to put Sumer and Egypt side by side because they originate in roughly the same time period, around 5 to 4,000 years ago, and they live not all that far apart on the other side of the opposite ends of the Fertile Crescent, and yet they develop profoundly opposing worldviews. The Sumerians tend to look at the natural world as being hostile to them, and the Egyptians see the natural world as being benevolent to them, and these starting points condition their views of the gods. And so the role of the ruler as intermediary between them, the king in Sumer is responsible for protecting humans from the chaos and occasional hostility of nature and the gods. The Sumerian king is a priest king who performs rituals to regulate the gods' relationship with the humans. The Egyptians' king is a god king who represents the gods' power in ruling over humans. During the New Kingdom, things are somewhat different. As I said, the Egyptians regain their power and independence, but they do so in a world that has changed around them. And as a result of this new, more interdependent, more cosmopolitan world, Egypt is no longer isolated, and the power of the pharaoh is no longer absolute. And as a result, there are more focuses of power in Egypt. The economy means that Egyptian merchants have a focus of power. The priests see an opportunity to exert more power over the pharaoh, and so forth. And one of the interesting things about this is that there's a greater visibility in the role of women, even in the aristocracy. The role of women in Egypt has always been a little bit different from what we see in other societies, and the reason for this is kind of ironic. In ancient Egypt, especially in the Old Kingdom, nobody has power, and so in the public world, and so men and women are more or less on the same footing. The complete power of the pharaoh and the disempowerment of everyone else means parity between the genders in the public world, because men and women are equally impotent. In the New Kingdom, things are a little bit more complicated, but we still see the basic idea that women have more mobility, more visibility, and in the New Kingdom, we actually see this emerging even within the royal family itself, the place where before you would expect the pharaoh to be the sole important figure. And so we see not only the emergence of powerful women, but even the emergence of at least one female king. What we're looking at here is Nefertiti, the famous wife of Akhenaten. And Akhenaten is famous for two things. One is for attempting to reform the religion, and the other is for ruling more or less side by side with his queen. The religious reform is interesting because essentially what Akhenaten does is the priests have been accumulating more and more power, developing more and more of a focal point around themselves. And this is overshadowing the power of the pharaoh. Akhenaten attempts to reverse this by creating a new cult of which he is the primary figure, worshiping one particular god, Amun-Re. And this is represented by his changing of the name. The name that he gives to this god is Aten, and the idea is that this cult is at the expense of all the other gods in the pantheon. And so Akhenaten is essentially trying to reform religion around a single god. This is not exactly monotheism. The other gods are still there; they're just diminished in importance. But this is an attempt to reassert the power of the pharaoh over the role of the gods in mortal life. And it's characteristic of the New Kingdom that this reform lasts only as long as Akhenaten reigns. When he dies, the priests reassert their power over his teenage successor, and his teenage successor reverts to the traditional role of Amun as one of many gods. And in token of this, he takes the name Tutankhamun. One of the other things that's going on in New Kingdom Egypt is there is an increased role of Egypt's relationship with outside peoples. Egypt has always had a relationship with Nubia, the land to the south, which has primarily consisted of raiding it for its goods. This has had the interesting effect of Nubia finding its identity in its pride, since it cannot find its identity through its wealth and power. And the increasing interaction with Nubia on a more trading level in the New Kingdom has had an effect on the Egyptians, because this whole idea of pride and identity in a nation other than themselves is something that the Egyptians are forced to sort of deal with and accept and recognize. The other vector along which this interaction with foreigners is taking place is across class. As the Egyptians have become more and more used to the kind of dependence on the bounty of the Nile, they've become more and more comfortable and accustomed to the agricultural wealth that they have. And over time, this has led to them accumulating a larger and larger slave class that performs the duties of harvesting and construction and menial labor throughout Egypt, so that the Egyptians themselves can sit back and relax. And this means that there is a large number of Semitic peoples in Egypt, peoples from the neighboring lands to the east, Canaan and Mesopotamia. And this includes a large number of, various different kinds of Canaanites, including large numbers of Hebrews. And so the Hebrews are present in Egypt during the New Kingdom, and this is part of the Hebrews' origin story that we will be looking at later. All right, so let's take a look at the readings very quickly, and then we can talk about them in the forums a little bit more. So the figure of Hatshepsut is extremely fascinating, and one of the things that that we want to look at is exactly how singular is she? Is she arrived to her position as a result of a fluke of events, or as a result of her, extremely powerful and unusual personality, or is it, a manifestation of something larger that we can say about Egypt? The basic idea here is, all of this is laid out in the reading on Hatshepsut for today. But so religious law says that only a man can be king, and a lot of this has to do. This is not necessarily about the superiority of men, because Egyptians, don't have as much need to believe in the superiority of men, because of the fact that, as I said, men and women are more or less on the same footing in public life. The main thing that is involved in the pharaoh needing to be a man is the idea of the military strength that the pharaoh represents, but even more importantly that the pharaoh is specifically a manifestation of Horus. So, Hatshepsut goes from being a princess to being a regent queen on behalf of a underage male pharaoh, to making herself, transforming herself, elevating herself from queen to pharaoh. Pharaoh alongside the young man who has come of age and is co-pharaoh alongside her. But Hatshepsut has a greater claim to royal blood. She's royal on both sides, and so her preeminence, both in terms of age and in terms of blood, allows her to be the senior pharaoh, the senior king. And so there's a great deal, the propaganda associated with this is simply to present herself as a man, to present herself as a king. So on the one hand, this is an innovation, this is something that is striking and unusual, and on the other hand, there's an extent to which you can talk about everybody who comes to any throne presenting themselves in terms of whatever the ideal, image of a king is in the minds of their citizens. But presenting yourself as a man is only part of the ways in which Hatshepsut, undertakes endeavors to be accepted by the people of Egypt. And perhaps even more importantly, to demonstrate that she has been accepted by the gods, that she is the rightful king. The rightful king is whoever it is that the gods choose to act through, whoever it is that is manifestly the agent of the gods. If Hatshepsut can do that through good rulership and through the accomplishment of what it is that kings are supposed to do to gift the people of Egypt with whatever the benevolence of the gods is, then she is the rightful king. And so part of this again is more propaganda. The story of her miraculous birth, which is something that you see in every society, unusual to see it in the context of a woman, but nonetheless, a very typical part of the story of unusually important monarchs. People like Cyrus the Great of Persia, or Romulus in Rome, and so forth. She undertakes an intensive building program. Her attention to the mending fences with the priests and ensuring the support of the priesthood in Thebes and the cult of Amun that the priests represent. More generally, the restoration of tradition. All of these are things that are designed to reinforce her standing with the other centers of power in Egypt. and undertaking expeditions to ensure the wealth and trade of Egypt. The statuary program in particular is designed to demonstrate her relationship with the gods' acceptance. And the best part of this is that that this is successful. That the story of Hatshepsut is one of a person who comes to the throne and reigns successfully, and there's a large extent to which her gender doesn't enter into it until after the fact. The denouement of this story is the removal of her imagery, the attempt to erase her from history that takes place after she dies. And the last article in the reading is particularly interesting on this account because the traditional take on this by historians is to assume that her co-pharaoh Thutmose III, who survives her, is retaliates for being suppressed and subordinated all of his life by tearing down her statues and walling up her inscriptions and so forth. But as this article points out, this doesn't take place until 20 years later, and has more to do with the possibility of another Hatshepsut arising, and the response, the reaction, literally a reaction in the political science sense, of conservative forces attempting to ensure that things go back to the way that they were. The innovation of a female king does not arise again. And so, the concept of a female king is what is repudiated in the damnatio memoria, the attempt to erase Hatshepsut from history. The irony of that is that all of the statues of Hatshepsut that Thutmose buried in a pit, the act of burying them in a pit tended to preserve them so that they were still intact and able to be dug up thousands of years later. Likewise, when Thutmose walled up her inscriptions, that had the effect of protecting them from the elements and from later generations. And so when the walls were removed, Hatshepsut's inscriptions were recovered and found to be in pristine condition. So the end of the story is that even after attempts to remove her from history, Hatshepsut had the last laugh. The wisdom literature article is interesting in that it is a male reaction. It is men talking to men about themselves and women forming a peripheral role. And there are a couple of things I just wanted to point out to you. One is that one of the things that Depla mentions in this is that unlike other ancient societies, the choice of husband is not in the hands of the father. The choice of husband is in the hands of the mother, in collaboration with the daughter herself. The whole discussion of adultery is very interesting. The idea that adultery is this terrible thing, but that men and women have an equal responsibility for and an equal temptation to. So the whole gender stigma that we often see associated with adultery is simply not present in Egypt, as far as we can tell from the wisdom literature. And more generally, that there are some aspects of Egyptian life that in which men have the primary responsibility, and there are other aspects of Egyptian life in which men and women are have some parity. And so this is different across time and across class, as we can see. But this is an example of this is a society where the understanding of gender is very much conditioned by the philosophy of the culture and their understanding of how the world works. The monumental marker article is also interesting because we're accustomed to seeing Egyptian monuments in terms of the ruling family, in terms of pharaohs and so forth. But as this article points out, there is a great deal of appearance of ordinary women in and ordinary men in Egyptian monuments, even monuments that feature, pharaohs will show ordinary Egyptians smaller in the conduct of their ordinary lives, or in the bringing of tribute, or in fulfilling the desires of the pharaoh, whatever. And so. And the other thing that I wanted to point out about this is the discussion of the form as being idealized in both the male form and the female form in Egyptian art. We'll come back. We'll re-encounter this amongst the Greeks, but the Greeks pursue the depiction of the idealized male and female form in their art for a somewhat different reason that we'll talk about later. Amongst the Egyptians, it's part of this idea that we encountered earlier of the preservation of the material form as being, elemental to the persistence of the spirit, both during life and afterwards. And so even if you don't have a mummy, which is available only to the upper classes for most of Egyptian history, you can still have an image of the ideal physical form of whoever it is that you are commemorating, and that physical manifestation is something that helps to connect the departed spirits to this life and ensure that spirit's contentment. And finally, the God's Wife of Amun. This is a good example of an article that is historiographical. In other words, this article is talking about the way historians have talked about this subject. And, the upshot is that we have this figure called the God's Wife, which is a particularly prevalent in the New Kingdom, and has to do with a woman who has a designated priestly role. For the most part, the priests in Egypt are men, but there are exceptions to this, and the God's Wife is among them. And so, we've always had the knowledge that this person exists, but there's always been debate over over what it means that this person exists. And so, previously we had the idea that this is indicative of the power of the pharaohship passing on by means of women, that the God's Wife of Amun is representative of the pharaoh deriving power through women. And the main point of this article is, of course, that this is not the case, that this idea needs to be discarded. But take a look at this article if you're reading it in terms of what we can say about the role of aristocratic women in the religious life of Egypt, the religious life being both institutional, which is sort of the public aspect of religion, and private as well. All right, so that's it for this lecture. So please, talk about how you react to the role of women in Egypt in general, and Hatshepsut in particular. What it is that stands out for you about Hatshepsut, how you think it became possible for for a woman to become pharaoh, and in light of the article that you read for today, and we'll have some further discussions. See you in the forums.